The ship landed in the middle of the night. It came down in a forest preserve outside Chicago, silent as a falling leaf. No fire, no smoke, no sound at all. The trees did not even move as the vessel settled between them, and within minutes the craft had buried itself beneath the earth, leaving no trace. Two figures emerged from the ground where the ship had vanished. They stood in the darkness and looked up at the orange glow of the city in the distance. Millions of lights, millions of lives. Neither of them had ever seen anything quite like it. Queen Era of the Dominion was tall even by the standards of her own species. Her true form stood at nearly 7 feet, with skin like polished crystal and 4 eyes that could see across the spectrum of light. She had ruled her empire for 300 years. Under her command, entire star systems had fallen. Civilizations had bent the knee or been reduced to dust. Beside her stood Queen of the Empire. She was shorter but no less dangerous. Her kind were shapeshifters by nature, their bodies flowing like water into whatever form they required. She had taken thrones, started wars, and ended them. In her long life, she had seen 1,000 species rise and fall. These two queens were not friends. Their empires had fought bitter wars in centuries past, but they shared something important. They both looked out at the galaxy and saw themselves as the only true powers worth mentioning, and they both had noticed the same troubling thing. Humanity was spreading. The first human colony ships had crossed into space 2 years ago. They were slow. They were primitive. Their technology was laughable by galactic standards, and yet they kept coming. More ships, more colonies, more humans pushing outward into the stars like they owned them. The two queens had met in secret to discuss this problem. They could crush humanity easily. A single fleet from either empire could reduce Earth to a burned rock in a matter of hours. But something made them pause. Something made them curious. They had watched humanity from afar. They had studied their broadcasts, their history, their wars, and they did not understand what they saw. Humans were weak. They lived for less than a century. They had no natural weapons, no armor, no telepathy, no hive connection. They fought among themselves constantly. They destroyed their own planet even as they lived on it. By every measure that mattered, they should have been nothing. And yet they built things. They dreamed things. They reached for stars they could never live to see. There was something wrong with them, something the queens could not explain from a distance. So they came to see for themselves. The holographic technology that covered their true forms was the finest in the galaxy. As they walked toward the city, their appearances shifted. Era became a tall woman with dark hair and sharp features, became a shorter woman with hair and soft eyes. They looked completely human. They even smelled human. Only the most advanced scanners could have detected the truth. They reached the city as the sun began to rise. Chicago spread out before them, vast and loud and impossibly busy. Vehicles roared past on the streets. People walked in every direction, thousands of them, moving with purpose and chaos at the same time. Era watched them with hidden contempt. They were like insects, scurrying, mindless, following invisible paths to invisible destinations. But notice something else. She noticed that they were not mindless at all. Each one of them was doing something different. Each one of them had a different destination, a different purpose, a different life. There was no central control, no queen giving orders. They simply moved together because they chose to. A man bumped into Era on the sidewalk. He was carrying a cup of coffee and talking into a small device pressed against his ear. He did not stop. He did not bow. He barely even looked at her. "Sorry," he said and kept walking. Era stood frozen. In 300 years of rule, no one had ever touched her without permission. No one had ever walked away from her without being dismissed. Her first instinct was to strike him down. Her second instinct was confusion. He had not known. He had no idea that he had just bumped into a being who could order his entire species destroyed. And he did not care. He had somewhere to be. "Laugh softly. Interesting," she said. They walked deeper into the city. They passed buildings that reached up toward the sky, taller than any structure either of them had seen on a primitive world. They passed restaurants and shops and parks filled with people. They passed a school where children played in a fenced yard, screaming and laughing as they chased each other. Era stopped to watch them. The children were small and fragile. They fell down constantly. They cried over tiny injuries. They fought over toys and then made peace moments later. "They are so weak," she said. "They are young," replied. "Give them time." A man approached them as they stood at a crosswalk. He was tall and broad with the bearing of a soldier. His name was Daniel, though they did not know that yet. He had served in wars they had never heard of. He had seen death and dealt it. And now he worked as a security consultant, protecting people who paid for protection. Daniel noticed the two women immediately, not because they were aliens. He had no idea about that, but because they stood differently than everyone else. They watched the city like they had never seen one before. They looked at traffic lights like they were trying to understand a puzzle. "First time in Chicago?" he asked. Era looked at him. In her experience, no one spoke to royalty without being addressed first. But this man simply stood there, waiting for an answer, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Yes," she said finally, "you could say that." Daniel smiled. "It takes some getting used to, the noise, the people, but it grows on you." He pointed down the street. "If you're looking for something to eat, there's a great diner 2 blocks that way. Best pancakes in the city." He nodded politely and walked away. Era watched him go. She had commanded armies. She had broken empires. And this man had just given her restaurant recommendations like she was any other visitor. Watched her companion carefully. She could see the confusion in Era's eyes. The queen was beginning to realize something that had suspected from the moment they landed. These humans did not know they were supposed to be afraid. They did not know that the galaxy was full of powers that could crush them without effort. They did not know that they were small and weak and insignificant. They walked through their lives like they mattered, like their choices mattered, like their little world with its little problems was the center of everything. It was either the greatest ignorance in the galaxy or something else entirely. The two queens walked on, deeper into the city, surrounded by millions of creatures who had no idea that their fate was being decided by the two women in their midst. And with every step, with every passing face, the queens began to suspect that the decision might not be as simple as they had thought. The queens spent their first full day walking through the city. They did not speak much. They simply watched. They watched people rushing to jobs they clearly hated. They watched mothers pushing small children in wheeled devices. They watched old men sitting on benches, feeding birds, content to do nothing at all. By evening, they had walked nearly 20 miles. Neither of them was tired. Their bodies were far superior to human forms, but they were mentally exhausted in a way neither had expected. There was too much to see, too much to understand. Suggested they find a place to rest and observe more carefully. She had noticed a building with a large dome and humans streaming in and out of it. A sign outside said it was a planetarium, a place where humans went to look at the stars. This amused her. These creatures could barely reach their own moon a few decades ago, and yet they built entire buildings dedicated to staring at the universe they could not touch. The two queens paid for tickets using currency they had fabricated from scans of human money. They walked into a large round room and sat in reclining chairs as the lights dimmed, and the ceiling came alive with projected stars. A woman walked to the center of the room. Her name was Dawson. She was young, perhaps 30 years old, with messy brown hair and glasses that kept sliding down her nose. She spoke into a microphone and her voice filled the room. "Welcome to the universe," she said. Era almost laughed. This human was going to explain the universe to them. The queens had traveled across galaxies. They had seen stars born and die. They had walked on worlds this woman could not even imagine. But they stayed silent, they watched. began to speak about the stars. She talked about how far away they were. She talked about how long their light took to reach Earth. She talked about the death of suns and the birth of new ones from the wreckage of the old. And then she said something that made both queens stop breathing. "Every atom in your body was forged inside a dying star," said. "The iron in your blood, the calcium in your bones, the oxygen you breathe. All of it came from stars that exploded billions of years ago. You are literally made of star stuff. You are the universe looking back at itself." The room full of humans nodded along. Children whispered to their parents. A teenager took notes. An old man smiled and closed his eyes like he was savoring the thought. Felt cold. These creatures knew. They understood their place in the cosmos. They knew they were small, brief, insignificant specks on a tiny rock orbiting an average star in the arm of an ordinary galaxy. They knew the universe would continue long after they were gone. And they did not despair. They built planetariums. They taught their children. They looked up at the stars with wonder instead of fear. After the show ended, the queens walked outside into the evening air. The city had transformed. Lights had come on everywhere, turning the streets into rivers of gold and white. Music drifted from somewhere nearby. The smell of food filled the air. They followed the sounds and smells to a street festival. Hundreds of people had gathered in a closed-off section of road. There were booths selling food and crafts. There were musicians playing instruments the queens did not recognize. There were people dancing, badly, joyfully, without any care for how they looked. Era stood at the edge of the crowd and tried to understand what she was seeing. In her empire, gatherings like this were dangerous. Large groups of people meant the possibility of rebellion, of conspiracy, of threat. Her people did not gather unless commanded to do so for specific purposes. But these humans had come together for no reason at all, just to be together, just to share food and music and the warmth of the evening. A small girl broke away from her mother and ran toward Era. She was perhaps 5 years old, with tangled red hair and a face full of freckles. She carried a small white flower in her hand. "This is for you," the girl said, holding out the flower. Era looked down at her. The queen had ordered the deaths of billions. She had burned worlds. She had watched entire species beg for mercy and received none. And now a child was offering her a flower. "Why?" Era asked. Her voice came out strange, choked. The girl shrugged. "You looked like you needed one." Then she ran back to her mother, laughing, already forgetting the tall woman she had given a gift to. Era stood holding the flower. It was small and white and would be dead within days. It was worthless by any reasonable measure, and yet she could not bring herself to drop it. Watched her companion with growing concern. The queen was changing. Something was happening inside her that neither of them had anticipated. They walked through the festival in silence. They ate strange human foods that tasted of salt and grease and sweetness. They watched couples hold hands and argue and kiss. They watched children run in circles until they fell down dizzy and laughing. At one booth, an old woman was selling paintings. They were simple things, pictures of flowers and trees and sunsets, nothing that would impress anyone in the great galleries of the empire. But the old woman was happy. She talked to everyone who stopped. She told stories about each painting. She laughed at her own jokes. She had lived a long life by human standards, and she was spending her final years making art that no one needed and selling it to strangers who would probably forget about it within months. And she was content. Bought one of the paintings. She did not know why. It was a picture of a sunset over a lake, the kind of thing that existed on a million worlds across the galaxy. But the old woman had painted it with her own hands, and she had smiled when handed over the money. "You have kind eyes," the old woman said. "I hope you find what you're looking for." Did not know what to say. She had not been called kind in 200 years. She had worked very hard to make sure no one would ever call her that. They left the festival as the night grew late. The streets were quieter now, but not empty. Humans walked in pairs and groups, talking softly, laughing, living their small lives as if those lives mattered. Era still held the flower. "We came here to decide their fate," she said quietly. "Yes," agreed. "I thought it would be simple." Looked at the painting in her hands. A sunset, a lake, the work of a dying woman who would be forgotten within a generation. "Nothing about this world is simple," she said. They walked back toward their ship in silence, carrying gifts from creatures who had no idea they had just given presents to the beings who might destroy them all. And neither queen could explain why those gifts felt heavier than anything they had ever carried before. On the third day, the queen saw something that changed everything. They had spent the morning in a coffee shop, watching humans come and go. The shop was small and crowded, and people waited in long lines for drinks that took minutes to prepare. No one complained. They stood patiently, staring at their small glowing devices, lost in worlds the queens could not see. Era had begun to notice patterns. Humans said thank you constantly. They apologized for small things. They held doors open for strangers. They smiled at each other for no reason. In her empire, such behavior would be seen as weakness. Kindness was a tool to be used carefully, never given freely. But here, humans gave it away like it cost nothing. She was beginning to suspect that maybe it did cost nothing. Maybe they had discovered something her people never had. The sound of sirens interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, they watched several large red vehicles race past. The humans in the coffee shop barely looked up. Sirens were common in this city. Emergencies happened every day. But something made the queens follow. They left the shop and walked quickly in the direction the vehicles had gone. After 2 blocks, they saw it. An apartment building, 12 stories tall, was on fire. Flames poured from windows on the 5th and 6th floors. Smoke rose in thick black columns against the morning sky. Crowds had gathered across the street. Police officers were pushing people back, creating space. And the red vehicles had stopped in front of the building, and humans in heavy gear were jumping out. Firefighters. The queens found a spot at the edge of the crowd and watched. A man named was leading the crew into the building. He was not tall, not impressive by any physical measure, but he moved with a purpose that both queens recognized. It was the walk of someone who had made a decision and would not be stopped. He disappeared into the smoke. "He will die," said quietly. Era nodded. The building was clearly failing. Parts of the upper floors had already begun to collapse inward. Any creature with basic survival instincts would stay far away. But the firefighters kept going in. Minutes passed. The crowd was silent. A woman nearby was crying, her hands pressed over her mouth. A man was shouting something about his children, fighting against police officers who would not let him approach. Then emerged. He came out of the front entrance carrying an old man over his shoulder. The old man was coughing, barely conscious, but alive, handed him off to waiting medical workers and turned around. He went back in. Era felt something she had not experienced in centuries. She felt fear, not for herself, but for this human she had never met. This small, fragile creature who was running into a burning building again and again. Other firefighters emerged with survivors. A mother and her baby, a teenager who had been trapped in a stairwell, an old woman in a wheelchair. One by one, they came out, carried by humans who had chosen to risk death for strangers. The building groaned. A section of the roof collapsed. The crowd screamed. But the firefighters were still inside. Grabbed Era's arm. "We should leave. If we are discovered here, if something happens." Era shook her head. She could not move. She could not look away. 3 more minutes passed. They felt like hours. Then emerged again. His coat was burned. His arms were red and blistered, and he was carrying 2 children, one under each arm. They were crying but alive. Medical workers rushed to take them. Someone tried to push toward an ambulance to treat his wounds. He shook them off. "Is that everyone?" he demanded. "Did everyone get out?" A police officer checked his radio, counted heads, finally nodded. "Everyone is accounted for." Only then did sit down. He sat on the curb, coughing smoke from his lungs, his burned arms hanging at his sides. A medical worker finally managed to approach him, spraying something on his wounds, wrapping them in white bandages. A woman with a camera approached, a reporter. "Sir, you're a hero. How does it feel to have saved all those people?" Looked at her like she had asked a strange question, like the answer was obvious. "I'm just a guy with a job," he said. The reporter tried to ask more questions but waved her away. He sat alone on that curb, watching the building burn, saying nothing. Era could not breathe. In her empire, warriors were celebrated. Great battles were commemorated for generations. Those who risked their lives for the throne were given titles and lands and power. But this human wanted nothing. He had run into fire for people he did not know and would probably never see again. He had nearly died, and he acted like it was simply what one did. Like there was no other choice. Was the first to speak. "Do your people have soldiers like this?" Era thought about it. They had warriors, certainly, great champions who fought for glory and reward, but they fought for the empire. They fought for recognition. They fought because they were ordered to or because they wanted the benefits that came with victory. She could not think of a single who would run into a fire for strangers. "No," she admitted, "we do not." Nodded slowly. They had similar warriors, fierce, loyal, capable, but they served the throne. They protected the queen. They did not protect random citizens from random dangers without any promise of reward. "We have been wrong," said. "Wrong about what?" "About what makes a species strong." Era looked at, still sitting on that curb, still refusing to leave until he was certain his crew was safe. His arms would scar. He would be in pain for weeks, and tomorrow he would go back to his station and wait for the next fire. "We thought strength was about ships," Era said slowly, "about weapons, about the ability to destroy." "Yes, but that is not what we are seeing here." Watch the crowd. Strangers were hugging each other. People who had never met were crying together. Someone had brought water bottles and was handing them out to anyone who needed one. "These creatures care about each other," she said. "Not just their families, not just their tribes, they care about strangers." Era finally understood why she could not drop the flower the little girl had given her. She understood why the old woman's painting had meant something. She understood why a man could bump into a queen and walk away without fear. These humans were not weak. They were simply strong in a way the queens had never seen before. And for the first time in 300 years, Era was not sure she was better than the creatures she had come to judge. On the fourth day, the masks came off. The queens had become comfortable, perhaps too comfortable. They had walked the streets of Chicago for 3 days without any problems. Their holographic disguises were the finest technology in the galaxy. There was no reason to think anything would go wrong. But something did. They were underground, in what humans called a subway station. It was loud and crowded and smelled strange. Humans packed together on platforms, waiting for metal tubes that would carry them beneath the city. Era found it fascinating. These creatures had built an entire transportation network underground, like insects burrowing through the earth. And they used it every day, thousands of them, trusting that the tunnels would not collapse and the trains would not crash. They trusted each other with their lives. The train arrived with a rush of air and noise. The doors opened. Humans poured out and other humans pushed in. The queens followed, standing near the back of a crowded car. Then the power surged. The lights flickered, the train shuddered, and for just a moment every electronic system in the station went wild, including the holographic emitters. Era felt her disguise fail. For half a second her true form was visible, 7 feet tall, crystalline skin, 4 glowing eyes. Then the power stabilized and the hologram snapped back into place. But half a second was enough. A teenage boy across the car was holding up his phone, recording a video for his friends. He had captured everything. He stared at his screen with wide eyes, then looked up at Era with his mouth hanging open. The queens exchanged a glance. They could eliminate the recording. They could eliminate the boy. Their technology could do many things. But shook her head slightly. They had killed enough, and something about this world had made them tired of killing. So they did nothing. Within an hour, the video was everywhere. Humans had a network they called the Internet, a way of sharing information that spread faster than any disease the queens had ever seen. The video jumped from platform to platform and shared millions of times. Experts analyzed it. Scientists studied it. News programs played it on endless loops. By evening, the whole world knew that aliens were walking among them. The queens found a quiet park and sat on a bench watching humans walk past. No one had recognized them yet. The video was blurry, the moment too brief for anyone to identify specific faces. But that would change. "We should leave," said. "Return to our ships. Come back with a proper delegation and military escort." Era shook her head. "No. No. We came here to understand these creatures. We have not finished." Studied her companion. Something had changed in the queen. The coldness that had defined her for centuries was cracking. "What do you want to do?" Era stood up. She looked out at the city, at the millions of lights, at the millions of lives. "I want to see what happens when they know." The next morning they walked to a public square in the center of the city. Crowds of people moved in every direction. Some had seen the video. Some had not. The city continued as it always did, too busy to stop for anything. A construction worker on his lunch break noticed them first. His name was Palmer. He was eating a sandwich and watching the crowds when he spotted 2 women who matched the description from the news. He did not run, he did not scream, he simply walked over. "So," he said, still chewing, "you two the queens everyone's talking about." Era made her decision in an instant. She let the hologram fall away. The crowd around them gasped and stumbled backward, but they did not run. They stood frozen, watching as a 7-foot alien queen revealed herself in the middle of their city. Era drew herself up to her full height. Her 4 eyes blazed with light. Her crystalline skin caught the sun and scattered it into rainbows. "I am Queen Era of the Dominion," she announced. "I rule 12 star systems. I command fleets that could destroy your world in hours." Looked at her for a long moment. Then he took another bite of his sandwich. "Cool," he said. "You want half turkey and Swiss." Somewhere behind him a woman laughed, then a man, then half the crowd. The tension broke like a wave hitting sand. Dropped her disguise as well. Her body shifted from human to, her form becoming fluid and shimmering. A teenager pushed forward, holding up his phone. "Can I get a selfie?" An old woman walked up to and touched her shimmering arm with gentle fingers. "What lovely coloring," she said, "like water in sunlight." A child tugged at her mother's hand. "Mom, is that a princess? She looks like a princess." The queen stood in the middle of a growing crowd, surrounded by creatures who should have been terrified. Creatures who should have fallen to their knees or fled in panic. Instead, they asked questions. They offered food. They complimented the queens on their appearance like they were tourists from another country instead of rulers of galactic empires. A police officer pushed through the crowd. Her name was Grant. She was short and calm and clearly used to managing strange situations. "Ladies," she said to the queens, "you're causing a bit of a crowd here. Mind if we move somewhere more comfortable? There's a coffee shop around the corner." Era stared at her. This small human, with her badge and her patient smile, was politely asking two galactic queens to relocate. And somehow it did not feel insulting. It felt reasonable. "Very well," Era said. They followed the police officer through the parting crowd. People took pictures, people waved. A few shouted welcome. No one attacked, no one panicked. In the coffee shop, bought them drinks. She explained that government officials would probably want to meet with them soon. She asked if they needed anything, if they were comfortable, if there was anyone they wanted to contact. She treated them like guests. Important guests, certainly, but guests nonetheless. Not conquerors, not threats, not gods to be or demons to be feared. Just visitors who had come a very long way. Era sat in a human coffee shop, holding a drink she could not actually consume, and realized that everything she thought she knew about power was wrong. These creatures were not afraid of her because they did not understand they should be afraid. They were not afraid of her because they had something stronger than fear. They had each other. The world changed in a day. By that evening, every government on Earth had scrambled to respond. Military forces went on alert. Scientists gathered in emergency meetings. The United Nations called a special assembly. Humanity was not alone in the universe, and the proof was sitting in a coffee shop in Chicago, drinking something it could not taste. The Queens were invited to New York the following morning. A helicopter carried them over the city, and they looked down at millions of humans going about their lives as if everything was normal. Perhaps for them it was. They had work to do, families to care for, problems to solve. The fact that aliens had arrived did not change the basic needs of living. The United Nations building was tall and gray, and surrounded by flags from every human nation. The Queens walked in and saw representatives from nearly 200 countries, all gathered in one room, all watching them with a mixture of fear and hope and curiosity. Era had addressed conquered peoples before. She had stood over the bodies of their leaders and dictated terms. She had been and feared and obeyed. This felt different. These creatures were not conquered. They were simply waiting to hear what she had to say. The Queens were led to a table at the front of the room. Across from them sat a woman named Grace. She was 62 years old, with gray hair and reading glasses and the patient expression of someone who had spent her life explaining things to people who did not want to listen. She had been a school teacher in Nebraska for 30 years before entering government service. Now, she was Earth's lead negotiator with the first alien species humanity had ever met. Era found her unimpressive. She was small, old, weak. She had no armies, no ships, no power worth mentioning. But Grace had something else. She had spent 3 decades teaching 5th graders. She had faced down angry parents, difficult administrators, and children who tested every limit imaginable. She had never backed down from any of them. "Welcome to Earth," Grace said. "We have some things to discuss." Era laid out the terms of surrender. She explained that the empires had jointly decided to offer humanity a choice. They could become a protectorate, protected and guided by the older civilizations. In exchange, they would accept the Queens as their rulers and follow the laws of the greater galactic community. Or they could refuse and face the consequences. The room was silent when she finished. Representatives whispered to each other. Some looked terrified, others looked angry. Grace simply nodded. "Thank you for the offer," she said. "We decline." Laughed, she could not help it. This old woman, speaking for a species that could be destroyed in hours, was refusing terms of surrender. "You misunderstand," said. "This is not a request. Our fleets could reduce this planet to ash." "Yes," Grace agreed. "You've mentioned that several times actually," she smiled. "But you won't." "And why is that?" Grace leaned forward. Her voice was calm and clear, the same voice she had used to explain fractions and photosynthesis to 10-year-olds. "Because you've spent a week among us. You've walked our streets. You've eaten our food. You've watched our firefighters run into burning buildings to save strangers. You've seen our children give flowers to people they've never met." She paused. "You know what we are now, and you know that if you destroy us, you will lose something the universe cannot replace." Era wanted to argue. She wanted to list all the species she had conquered, all the civilizations she had crushed. She wanted to remind this human that power came from strength, from force, from the ability to break anything that stood in your way. But she could not speak, because she still had the flower, the small white flower that a 5-year-old girl had given her for no reason at all. She had kept it. She had preserved it with her own technology. She could not explain why. Grace continued. "You've conquered other species. I believe that. But you've never found another like us, have you? Creatures who know they will die and choose to love anyway, who build for generations they will never see, who run into fire for strangers." The room was completely silent. "You didn't come here to conquer us, your majesties. You came here because your empires are old and tired, and you've forgotten what it means to be alive. We reminded you." Era looked at. The queen was staring at Grace with an expression Era had never seen before. It took her a moment to recognize it. Respect. The negotiations continued for hours. They continued for days. They continued for weeks. But the basic shape of them had been set in that first moment, when a retired schoolteacher had looked 2 galactic queens in the eye and told them no. In the end, the treaty was unlike anything either empire had ever signed before. Not a protectorate, a partnership. Humanity would remain independent. They would govern themselves. They would choose their own path among the stars. In exchange, they would share something the empires had lost long ago. Their hope. The queens returned to their ships 6 months later. Era carried the preserved flower in a case of crystal, where she would keep it for the rest of her long life. Left behind a proposal that would shake her empire to its foundations, a cultural exchange program with Earth, bringing humans to the stars and aliens to human cities. She personally requested that lead the first delegation. "You want a firefighter to represent humanity?" her advisors asked. "I want a human to represent humanity," she replied. Back in Chicago, Daniel read about the treaty while drinking his morning coffee. He remembered the 2 strange women he had met at the crosswalk all those months ago. He had known something was different about them. He smiled. He had seen a lot of powerful people in his life. Generals, politicians, business leaders, people who thought their titles made them important. But he had also seen the other kind of power. The kind that came from helping a stranger for no reward. The kind that came from giving flowers to people who looked sad. The kind that came from building things that would outlast you. That was the power humanity had always understood. Not the power to destroy. The power to give. Somewhere above him, beyond the atmosphere, the ships of 2 galactic empires turned toward home. Their queens looked back at the small blue planet and felt something they had not felt in centuries. Hope. The galaxy would never be the same. And that was exactly as it should be.